Hi, I want to talk to you today about conflicts of interest. And the subject of this video is going to be simple. What is a conflict of interest? How do we go about defining conflicts of interest? A conflict itself is something we might describe as a situation, here borrowing from Plato, where we feel torn between two different courses of action. Two things that are incompatible with one another. We can't do both. And so we feel some pull in this direction, some pull in that direction. But that's describing a kind of moral conflict in general, or a psychological conflict even. And we're interested specifically in a conflict of interest. We might think of a conflict of interest as simply two interests pulling us in different directions. One interest this way, one interest that way. But in fact, it's not quite so simple. For one thing, that's much, much too broad. There are all sorts of conflicts of interest that all of us experience all the time. In making investments, for example, I care about returns, but I also care about safety. And those two things can pull me in opposite directions. I tend to get greater potential returns from riskier investments. And the same thing can be true in all sorts of other simple contexts where I am torn between two possible courses of action. So that's very broad, and really life consists of those kinds of choices and trade-offs. So if we define a conflict of interest that way, we're all in a situation of conflicts of interest all the time. So let's remove that thought and think much more specifically about professional conflicts of interest. In many professions, there is a sort of rule. You've got to avoid conflicts of interest. But what exactly does that mean? Now, the first thing to say is that it's not merely an interest pulling us in each direction. It's a question of duty, a question of responsibilities. And so we have specifically some responsibilities that pull us in one direction, but some interests that pull us in another direction. And so if we don't have responsibilities in either case, it's simply a matter of choosing, a matter of making trade-offs. It's just part of ordinary decision-making. However, when we have a responsibility and we've got some incentive not to fulfill our responsibility, then we're getting closer to what people are referring to when they talk about conflicts of interest. But to make that more precise, we need to draw a couple of distinctions. First of all, the distinction between professional obligations and other kinds of obligations. It might be that I have an obligation to do some things with my family, but I also have an interest in, let's say, pursuing this solitary pursuit of playing a video game or reading a book or taking a walk. Those things are in competition with one another, but that's not a conflict of interest in the sense that we're interested in here. So we have in mind specifically professional responsibilities, professional duties, not merely ones that I might have in some other role as a human being, as a parent, as a child, as a sibling, and so on. This is something that is going to be specifically professional, connected to my position. A second distinction that we've talked about already is the distinction between perfect and imperfect obligations. A perfect obligation is specified in various ways, so I have an obligation to do a specific thing for a specific person. That's in contrast to an imperfect obligation, which is indeed still an obligation, still a duty, but on the other hand allows me lots of choice. So charity is the traditional example of that. I have an obligation to, let's say, help the less fortunate, but there is no specific person, no specific way in which I must do this. And so there I've got lots of choice. On the other hand, if I've made a promise to someone, then I have a perfect obligation to fulfill that promise. So what are we interested in here? We're interested in perfect obligations of a professional nature. So it's a case of interest coming into conflict with a professional perfect obligation. Something that my job imposes on me that isn't just, oh, do this enough. When I have a perfect obligation, then I'm in danger, because then I've got a professional, perfect obligation to do something specific for some specific person. And in that case, that competing interest is something that really does create a tension. That obligation of a perfect nature can't simply be deferred to another time. But there are a number of things we need to get clearer about. First of all, what do we mean by an interest of mine? What kind of interest? And is it specifically mine alone? What about friends? What about families? What about other people whose causes I champion? What about my employers? So I need to think more generally here about not only my direct obligations, but my indirect obligations. Suppose, for example, something would violate my professional, perfect obligations. Wouldn't really benefit me personally in any direct way, but would benefit my daughter, let's say, or would benefit a close friend, or would strongly benefit my employer. Is that something permissible for me to do? Well, that's the kind of thing that does look like a conflict of interest. Something that was in the news not long ago is Hunter Biden and his position as a board member of Burisma, a Ukrainian gas company, while his father was vice president and given the task of heading up U.S. policy toward the Ukraine. It's not that Hunter Biden necessarily did anything wrong there, but it does appear to be a conflict of interest on Joe Biden's part. His son could benefit from various decisions he made as a policymaker toward the Ukraine. And that's the kind of situation that we need to include as well. There is, as it were, the direct benefit to a party whose interest conflicts with some kind of duty, but then we also have family members, friends, maybe employers, maybe other close associates, maybe someone I'm simply a fan of for some reason because we have something in common, let's say. All of those are potentially interests of mine. So let's refer to those as direct or indirect interests of mine. Presumably, I do have an indirect interest in helping my family members, my friends, my employer, people I champion for one reason or another. A second unclarity has to do with the nature of these responsibilities and to whom I have these responsibilities. The most obvious answer to that is my employer. I have professional responsibilities to my employer, and that's certainly true. But of course I can have professional responsibilities to my coworkers, to my boss, to a variety of organizations I might be part of. After all, I might be a member of a professional engineering organization or accounting organization, and I may have obligations to them as well. So professional obligations here might be specific to my employer. They might be specific to an organization of that kind that I belong to. It might be much more general. For example, a journalist, you might say, has an obligation, professional obligation, to report the news accurately and objectively. You might think that a physician has a professional obligation to do no harm and to help patients. A lawyer has professional obligations to help clients, to stay within the bounds of the law, to act as an agent of the court. And all of those kinds of professional obligations are real. They aren't specific to a given employer. They may not be specific to any particular organization that someone belongs to. Nevertheless, they are very real professional obligations due to the very nature of that profession. So we want to have in mind here things that might be tied to a specific organization or a specific corporation, a specific employer, but it may be tied to people within that company. It may be tied to customers or various other groups that interact with that company. It might be a much more general professional obligation that isn't tied to any specific organization or entity at all. The last unclarity concerns the nature of conflict. What do we mean when we say that there's a conflict between an interest, direct or indirect, and then a professional obligation? One thing to think about here is to say, well, does it mean that these pull me in different directions? That sounds like a psychological notion. Is it there are norms pushing in opposite directions, and so I've got a conflict, whatever my psychological state is, just due to the normative pull in one direction or another? So is this a psychological conflict where I feel pulled between an interest, direct or indirect, and professional responsibility? That seems to make it a psychological matter. Is it something that is normative? It's a question of one norm pulling me in one direction, one norm pulling me in the other direction, and so that can be true independently of my own state of mind, independently of any psychological conflict. Is it the case that this could, might, would, has some probability of actually preventing me from fulfilling my professional obligation? Different people react in different ways here. So Black's Law Dictionary, for example, talks about a clash. Well, clash isn't much better than conflict here. That suggests the same set of questions, so that's no answer at all. John Boatwright talks about interference and says it's a matter of interests interfering with my professional responsibilities. But again, what kind of interference? A psychological interference? A normative interference? Is it a question of my likelihood of actually being disrupted by this? Raises certain questions. For example, Suppose I'm a virtuous person who isn't even tempted not to fulfill my professional responsibilities. Does that mean it doesn't interfere, and so a virtuous person would never face a conflict of interest? That seems extreme and surprising. Suppose I'm strong-willed. I feel the temptation, but nevertheless, I successfully am able to suppress temptation in a very high percentage, maybe let's just say always. Does that mean I'm exempt from conflicts of interest? What about the person who is rather weak-willed and gives in a lot? Does that mean they face a lot more conflicts of interest? So we have to be careful about these notions and think cautiously about exactly what kind of interference or clash or conflict we have in mind. Thomas Carson defines it this way. He speaks of a conflict between I, the agent's interests, or his desire to promote or thwart the interests of third parties, and the interests of P, that is to say the professional person toward whom there is some sort of duty, which make it difficult for I to discharge his official duties to P. So here we've got talk of interests making it difficult to fulfill your professional responsibilities. But again, what do we mean by making it difficult? That's a bit like interference. Does that mean it creates some psychological tension in me? Does that mean it creates a normative situation which might be difficult for someone to resolve? Does it mean that I am likely, or at least might, fail to fulfill my responsibilities? So there's a lot here that remains at the level of metaphor in typical definitions. Ideally, we'd like to get much clearer about whether we're talking about a psychological notion, a normative notion, something else, whether it's the case that essentially the more virtuous I am, the fewer conflicts of interest I face, or whether it has nothing to do with my ability to withstand the temptation of allowing my interests to keep me from fulfilling professional responsibilities. All of those are important questions. And it seems to me typically what people have in mind is meant to be independent of someone's psychological state. It's meant to be independent of how virtuous or weak-willed somebody is. Instead, it's a question of a normative clash, a normative tension, where basically if I am to promote my own interests, which ordinarily would be fine for me to do, and in fact you might even say in a practical sense I ought to do that, that comes into conflict with a norm that says, no, you have a perfect obligation to do this from a professional point of view because of the position you hold. And so I think what we want here is specifically a normative conflict rather than a psychological one. But that does raise additional issues. Does that mean that my own awareness of things doesn't matter? Suppose I don't know about the interests that I have. Suppose I don't know about the nature of that professional obligation. So perhaps this is part of my job, but nobody ever told me that it's part of my job. Or maybe, yes, it turns out I have an interest here. Yes, I own shares in a mutual fund that happens to have this as one among its 1,000 investments. And so I actually do have a stake in that company, but I wasn't even aware of that. Well, how important is all of that? Moreover, does it matter how significant this is? How large an interest I have? How significant my professional responsibility is? So, what do I have in mind? Well, suppose it turns out I do have a very tiny stake in some company. Does it mean I can't be involved in the decision making when really I have very little to gain or lose as a result of this? There's something, but it's very little, very small amount. Or suppose it's the same with a responsibility. Yes, I'm really technically supposed to do such and such and such and such, but actually almost everybody ignores that. It's on page 317 of the telephone book size employment contract that I have, and it's routinely ignored because nobody ever reads to page 317. Well then, gosh, how serious is there really a conflict of interest here? And so those are important questions too. It seems to me ideally we would want to say that a conflict of interest is a matter of a significant interest of mine coming into conflict with a significant professional responsibility. And then we can say the conflict normatively is one that we should be able to spell out in terms of conflicting obligations, ideally in terms of the logical structure of the situation, not my psychological reaction to it. There's one other critical question we have to address, a question that Socrates frequently brings up in the Platonic dialogues. Are we talking about a real interest or a perceived interest? A real obligation or a perceived obligation? A real conflict or a perceived conflict? Now, at first glance, you might think that's a strange question to ask, but I can have interests that I'm unaware of. It might be that doing something would really benefit me, but I have no idea what that is, and so I'm completely unaware of this interest I have. It might be that making a decision one way or as opposed to the other would actually greatly disadvantage me or somebody I care about deeply, but I have no way of knowing that, no way of anticipating it. Am I in a situation of conflict of interest as a result of that? The same sort of thing can happen in the other direction. So it might be that I think I have an interest that actually I don't have. I might think my interests are strongly promoted by choosing A over B, but actually the other choice would be just as good. And so I can be wrong about what my interests are, directly or indirectly, and in a sense, the more indirect, the easier it is for me to be mistaken about it. But the same thing's true of professional responsibilities. There might be responsibilities I have that I'm unaware of, that I do not perceive. And so I'm not aware that I'm supposed to be doing that. In fact, students sometimes have the nightmare of walking into class and finding there's an exam on that day, and they had no idea, they're completely unprepared. The professor's version of that is you find out halfway through the term that you were supposed to be teaching some course, and somehow you were unaware of this. The chairman comes up to you and says, "Hey, why aren't you teaching this class? You're supposed to be in there. Students have been waiting for you since September." And so you go running across campus. You eventually find the classroom, and amazingly, students have been sitting there for 2 months, angrily waiting for you to show up. Okay, and then you look and you realize, wait, this is a course in something I know nothing about. Let's say, in my case, 17th century French poetry. And suddenly I realize, wait, I'm supposed to be teaching French poetry from the 17th century, and it's now November, and I didn't even know about this? And it's, anyway, a panic-inducing thought. But there can be professional responsibilities you are unaware of in a less extreme form. So maybe there are things that you were supposed to do, but you never opened that email, you never read that memo, and so on. And so that's something it's easy to be mistaken about. Conversely, you can think you have responsibilities you do not have. I know some people who have, as it were, hyperactive superegos, who think they have all sorts of professional responsibilities that really they don't have, who go to the office and insist that their staff show up at the office every day, even though the state has said because of the coronavirus, it is not essential that people in your position report to work. But they may say, still, I have a professional responsibility to go. And that's something that can be a misperception. The same thing is true, finally, with the nature of the conflict. I might see a tension between these two things when there is no tension. It is actually possible to promote that interest and fulfill that responsibility. It's just that I didn't think of that option. I didn't think of a way to do it. Or it could be, conversely, that there is a real tension and I'm unaware of it. I go blithely on not thinking about the fact that really, if I pursue this interest, then I can't fulfill that responsibility, and I put myself in a position where I can't promote that interest or I can't fulfill that responsibility without even being aware that there was a choice to be made. So in this case, what matters? Is it the perception or the reality? The person who feels a very strong, hyperactive sense of professional responsibility and thinks they have all sorts of responsibilities they don't really have may feel psychologically as if they're in a state of conflict of interest. But actually there is no norm pushing them that way. So if we define the conflict normatively, we'll be tempted to say that actually, no, perceptions don't really matter here. What we're interested in is the actual clash between an actual interest and an actual professional obligation. However, if we think of this in more psychological terms, then we're tempted to say the perception is what matters. After all, if there's a real normative clash, but I'm completely unaware of it, you might say, gosh, then I can just avoid any worry about this by being completely oblivious to my professional obligations and my interests. Well, yeah, I can. That will allow me to escape psychological conflict. It won't keep me out of the normative ones. And so, is being oblivious a way of avoiding conflicts of interest? Probably not, which tells us we do need to include the normative as well as the psychological aspects. But on the other hand, we could also say, does that mean the person who imagines all sorts of responsibilities and interests that they don't really have, is that person really facing a conflict of interest? Well, if you think the answer is yes, then you're going to think Carson is right to say it's really a psychological or a normative conflict we're interested in, so we want to pay attention to both the real and the perceived interests, responsibilities, and clashes. One way of thinking about this is to say that I'm worried about placing myself in situations where I will fail to fulfill a responsibility. The reason we care about conflicts of interest from a normative point of view and think people should avoid them when possible is that we don't want them failing to fulfill their professional responsibilities. Those are their actual professional responsibilities we're talking about, not just their perceptions of one. So it seems to me, at least with respect to responsibilities, there's a pretty strong argument to thinking we must pay attention to the actual duties, the actual responsibilities, and not the perceived ones. Now, on the other side of things, when we think of interests, we realize something that can pull me away is a real interest of mine, but also a perceived interest of mine. I may think it's strongly in my interest to do this, and that does give me a reason, not really a normative reason, but a motivational reason, a psychological reason to avoid my responsibilities. And so I think there's an important sense in which we might want to answer these questions differently. To say, I care about the real responsibilities, not the perceived ones, but I care about perceived interests, maybe instead of, or certainly in addition to, the actual interests that pull someone aside. After all, if I'm creating rules for a professional organization, I don't know what interests people perceive themselves as having, but I do know about some things I can say about the actual interests that will be at stake. And so there's strong reason there to include both the actual and the perceived interests. The nature of the clash? Well, there too, it seems to me, I'm interested in what might tempt someone away from fulfilling their actual obligations. And so there too, there might be an argument for a perceived clash. If somebody thinks there's a clash, then it may be that that's enough to generate a conflict of interest for them, because that does give them a motivational reason not to fulfill that normative professional perfect obligation. So I myself am inclined to think we might want to agree with Carson with respect to the interests and the nature of the conflict, but we probably want to insist on actual professional obligations, not merely obligations that I perceive that I have. So that's my own thought currently, but I admit that's really just a start. Thinking through these issues is hard and requires very careful development. I'm not going to do that here, this is already long enough. But that's the kind of thing we need to think about to get more precise about exactly what a conflict of interest is.